Welcome, and thank you for joining us this evening for our latest History Talks at Kane Community Forum. The history we will be discussing tonight, while it has become newly important and newly urgent, is, like most of the issues we have discussed in this forum, not new. Indeed, it is hundreds of years, just over 400 years in the making, marked by the arrival of the first enslaved Africans who were brought to North America. And it is local. For tonight, we will be telling a most local part of that history in a talk entitled History, Slavery, and Liberty Hall, Recovering Lost Voices by Professor C. Breed Nicholson. Liberty Hall was given its name in context of the American fight for independence from the British. Letters show future Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, John Jay, William Livingston's son-in-law, calling it such during the American Revolution in letters that he wrote back to his in-laws. But it must be acknowledged that the liberty for which William Livingston fought was not shared equally, even in his own household. William Livingston, the founder of Liberty Hall, claimed ownership over an unknown number of African persons during his lifetime, before freeing those enslaved people late in his life. The Kane family, too, engaged in the institution of slavery, both in South Carolina and New Jersey, claiming ownership of over 100 enslaved persons in the 18th and early 19th centuries before manumission and then abolition brought an end to their enslavement. Both the Livingston and Kane families built wealth around labor conducted by the enslaved. Claiming ownership over enslaved African people, even in New Jersey and other northern states, was not unique to either the Livingston or the Kane families. In 1800, more than 5,000 New Jersey families claimed ownership over at least 12,000 African men, women, and children. This history is not easy, but it is important to acknowledge and confront it. For it is in the acts of acknowledging and confronting the most difficult parts of our history that we recalibrate our individual and collective moral compasses to guide us to a more just future. It is in this spirit that Liberty Hall Museum and the Department of History are collaborating to accelerate our study of slavery and its connections to Liberty Hall. With the support of the 1772 Foundation and guided by the principles of the University Studying Slavery Consortium, this summer, John Kane Sr., Rachel Goldberg of Liberty Hall, Dean Jonathan Mercantini of the College of Liberal Arts, and I sat down together to plot a course forward in recovering, acknowledging, and confronting this past. And we have much progress to report. With the support of the NEH, we have, with the assistance of Kane students and alumni Caleb Dagnall, Caleb Doyle, and Nicole Skalenko, created a website through which students taking History 1062, Worlds of History, the GE history course required of all Kane students, are already learning about the Atlantic slave system through original primary source documents connected to the Livingston and Kane families. That is 1,500 students this academic year alone. Students in upper level history courses are digging into this history as well. The podcast of history majors Jeffrey Gomez, Mark Andrew Duvelson, and Ruqayya Abdul Rahman, for example, is available on our website. And this semester, Dr. Nicholson, Associate Professor and Assistant Chair in the Department of History, and our speaker tonight is teaching a special topics history course on slavery and Liberty Hall. In addition to wrestling with this history, students in this course are creating an exhibit and FAQ documents about slavery at Liberty Hall that will help Liberty Hall Museum share this history with the thousands of K-12 students and others who visit the museum each year. But these steps are just the beginning of what we hope will be a cross-campus interdisciplinary collaboration in the coming academic years. What you're about to hear is a story and analysis that is the result of exemplary historical detective work. Research, the uncovering and analysis of evidence to create knowledge and to teach it, what a university is all about. It's a painful story, but an important history to tell, not because of its connections to the Livingstons and Kanes, but because the basic contours of the history that Dr. Nicholson is about to share were repeated again and again all over revolutionary America, woven into the lives of the hundreds of thousands of enslaved men and women in unique and horrific ways who were part of the fabric of America. The history Dr. Nicholson is going to narrate is that of how an enslaved woman named Celia, originally from South Carolina, ended up making her mark on a Philadelphia, Pennsylvania court document. We know that her story is safe in Dr. Nicholson's hands, as she has a distinguished record of women's history telling. Dr. Nicholson's first book was Emma Goldman, Still Dangerous. More recently, her anthology of documents on the Lewis and Clark expedition highlights the crucial role of Sacagawea to ensuring the success of the mission. During the talk, feel free to contribute questions via the Q&A feature. This is a webinar, so you won't see the questions that have been submitted, but our speakers will. For those of you watching via our YouTube channel, you can email questions to me at ehyde, E-H-Y-D-E, @kane.edu. When Dr. Nicholson is done, she will be joined by Dr. Jonathan Mercantini, Acting Dean of the College of Liberal Arts. Dr. Mercantini was the first scholar to examine the primary sources documenting slavery in the Kane family. In 2012, he published the article, John and Susan Kane and the Culture of Slavery in the New Nation. In the intervening years since that article's publication, through the hard work of Dr. Nicholson, Dr. Mercantini, and student historians in the Department of History, and the sharp eye of university archivist Aaron Algendor, more documents are coming to light. This includes documents in the Liberty Hall collection, in the Special Collections Research Library and Archives, or SCRLA, at Kane University, now newly uploaded and accessible to everyone online via Digital Commons, as well as documents in Liberty Hall Museum and documents in archives around the United States, in the United Kingdom, and in the Caribbean that allow Dr. Nicholson to tell the history she will share with you tonight. And historians have developed new ways of asking questions of the documents that survive, so that more can be understood about the lives of the enslaved. This is the approach that you will hear tonight in Dr. Nicholson's talk.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. Thank you to my colleagues. And as Dr. Hyde said, this is Women's History Month as well. And in that regard, I would like to send out a special thank you to my women colleagues in the history department tonight. Dr. Jerome Kong, Dr. Marguerite Mayhall, Dr. Abigail Perkis, Dr. Jacqueline Turk-Stormberg, and somebody who's always going to be part of our history department, Dr. Sue Grunwald. I especially want to pay thanks to our chair of the history department, Dr. Elizabeth Hyde, who not only has to be chair, but also somehow has to survive as my colleague, my friend, and my boss. And believe me, if you had to be my colleague, my friend, and my boss, you deserve a special shout out as well. I would also like to thank Liberty Hall. I'd like to thank everybody, my students in particular, for this opportunity, for their work. And what I'd like to do tonight is I would like to share with you a story, and I'm going to share my screen, as I so often do. And then, as I so often do, I hope that it works. It is working. That's always good. You know, tonight, as we look at this first slide, I want to thank Nicole for the photograph. I want everybody to realize that in the history department, we look out our windows and this is what we see. We see Liberty Hall. But tonight, as you look at this photograph and as you listen to this talk, I would ask you not just to look, but to look again. I would ask you not just to look, but to see. I would ask you not just to see, but to hear and to listen. And as you look and you see and you hear and you listen to this story tonight, her story tonight, I would like you to be ready to speak some names. And the reason I say that to you is history, while it seems to be all about remembering, it often forgets. History has been known to silence. History silences, sometimes mistakenly, but sadly, often purposefully. And with this purposeful forgetting comes that worst historical action of all, erasure. And my students and I in our 4000 history class a couple of weeks ago attended a webinar done by the University of Texas with Dr. Ramney Berry and Nicole Hannah-Jones of the 1619 Project. And both of them reminded everybody that was on that webinar of the importance of history, that history could not be erased. So what I would like you to do tonight is I'm going to use one person, the name Celia, and I'm going to use her story in an attempt to tell the story of the enslaved people who lived at Liberty Hall, others who lived in various other towns and places in New Jersey, in South Carolina, in Georgia, in the islands of Jamaica. And through this story, I'm hoping that we can all learn together and to say this name. A number of months ago, I got my hands on this document. It's a divorce document. It's an 18th century divorce, and in all honesty, it was a very expensive divorce. In money today, it was $1 million+ divorce. But in all honesty, what's important about this document is not the two people who got divorced. I want to draw your attention to something else that was on this paper. This. There is the mark of Celia, an enslaved woman over whom the Kane family was to claim ownership. There is her mark, a legal mark that was recognized by American court system on the 10th of September, 1795. It's an important moment because at that moment, Celia can no longer be erased. But to help her non-erasure, I would like you, wherever you are tonight, simply to say her name. Say the name Celia. Recognize her. Recognize her tonight on behalf of all the enslaved people that we're going to talk about. She's an important woman. She is the focus of my talk tonight, but she's not the only enslaved person that I'm going to talk about tonight. In this remarkable document, which I'm going to try and show you here, it describes her as Celia, a free woman of the city of Philadelphia. She had been manumitted literally a few months before. And the most amazing part to me about this document, as I say, is not the divorce, it's the biographical information that's contained in these first two paragraphs here. Here, I discovered her age. I discovered where she was during the Revolutionary War, where she specifically was during the siege of Charleston, what tasks she had in the house, what jobs she had to do, where she lived, where she was forced to live, who she was forced to work for. It was a document that, in all honesty, pained me, excited me, and made me just sit and wonder, okay, at how this woman had survived so much. What it also was part of a collection, a method of history that I had been doing for a number of years. Because what I had started to do a number of years ago was collect the names of every enslaved person I had come across in letters, in bills, in documents, in wills, in inventory. And every time I had a name, I wrote it down. I wrote down the date. I wrote down where I found the document. I wrote down if there was a link, and I added it together with the idea of creating biographies of each and every enslaved person as much as I could. Like any historian, I obviously need lenses where I can actually study. And these are 4 of the lenses I have used, though I will mention a few more. The obvious brilliant work done by Professor Annette Gordon-Reed at Harvard on the Hemings family is second to none. I'm also very grateful to the work of Dr. Ramney Berry out of the University of Texas, who specifically works in the area of South Carolina and Georgia in areas of gender. And there are 2 databases in particular that I want to mention tonight, both from the UK, one done by University College London and the other by the University of Bristol. The University of Bristol one is about to come online. It's not there yet. And the one from the University College London is actually available online. And it's that type of database that I'm going to talk about at the end, even though it's going to be slightly different. What I try and do in my work is the following. I look at a document that perhaps other people have looked at before. I note the document, I note the year, but I look at it differently. Sorry, having slight issues here. I put down the document, pick up the document, and then I look again at the document, because by looking again at the document, by flipping the narrative of the document, what it does is it opens up a new world to me, a new world to historians. It gets rid of that erasure. It takes people out of the silence so that Serpico and Claudia and Flora and Phyllis and Deanna and Sam and Abram and Phoebe and Chloe and Tessie and Grace and Phoebar and Patty and Gretchen and Syl and Di and their children can all be remembered. By this flipping of the narrative, what I have found is that there are more and more names in these documents, more people, more lives, more biographies, more children, and it's vitally important that each of these is remembered. So in each of these occasions, I go back to my Excel spreadsheet, I write down the name, I write down where I found it, and I add, and I add, and I add. At this stage, with that one document, there was 16 names of adults and 14 children. So when it comes to Celia, I had this moment in history. It was 1795. She had been manumitted in John Kane's will. She had testified in court. Now, 1811 is an important year in terms of Liberty Hall, because in Liberty Hall in 1811, Peter Kane buys it in trust for his mother. And I had this moment of, I wondered, had Celia been to Liberty Hall? Was it possible? Now, you have to understand one thing here that's really important. Celia was manumitted by John Kane in his will. Manumission is not abolition. Manumission is certainly not emancipation. And under no circumstances should you ever consider that manumission is equality. But in his will, John Kane is very clear when he says, I declare her a free woman. But there's a but. He's going to pay her an annuity, what you and I would call a wage, of $50, provided she agrees to live with and faithfully serve her present mistress, so long as she shall choose. So I had this interesting idea. Did she live at Liberty Hall? Was Celia there? When I looked out my window, was Celia there? We know they had budgeted for Celia, and my thanks to the people at Liberty Hall. They were amazing this summer. They let myself and Dr. Hyde in. And one of the many documents we found was this one. It's a 1792 document where already there were budgeting and cashing. And as you can see here, this annuity of $50 is already there for Celia. And I did realize, however, in order to study this, I needed to start away from Liberty Hall because 1811 was too late. And I needed to go back to letters. I needed to go to bills of sale, which I'll show you in a minute. I needed to go through legal documents, particularly wills, but just so the undergrads in particular know, the inventories related to the wills are actually more important. In those inventories, they detail every single aspect of a person's estate. And in the 18th and early 19th century, that obviously includes the enslaved people. So I have this moment and I realize I have to go back. And when I go back, I ended up going back to 1756 to June 29th, to a very strange moment in history, a moment in history that, as I sit here, disturbs me still. I have to be very honest with you, because it's at that moment that I have, for now at least, a piece of paper that in all honesty shows a record of the very first enslaved person that a Kane family member bought in the colonies. The date was June 29th, 1756. And if you look here, there it is. James Kane, who was the first member of the Kane family to come to the colonies. And he buys a boy for 130 probably pounds at the time. This is the first record Kane family member purchasing an enslaved person in the colonies. In one of those very strange, very awful moments of history, we actually happen to know a lot about this particular sale. We even know quite an amount about the journey, the horrific journey of this young man as he was forced to come to the colonies. The sale was actually advertised on 17th of June, 1756, with this rather disgusting advertisement that was in the South Carolina Gazette. You can see it says, just imported in the Hare's the name of the ship, Captain Caleb Godfrey, directly from Sierra Leone, a cargo of likely and healthy slaves, to be sold upon early terms on Tuesday, the 29th of June, by Austin and Lawrence, two of the biggest slaveholders in South Carolina at the time. Now, if you go to the transatlantic slave voyages and you type in Hare, you will cut. There's two versions. One is a British ship, one is an American ship. The American ship that we're interested in is this one in 1756. And in one of those strange quirks of history, a number of years ago, Professor Skip Gates, Professor Henry Gates of Harvard, actually did a documentary on this particular ship. And he actually managed, he does in the story, he explains the life of this young African woman who was sold in the same auction as this young boy. So we actually know quite a lot about this. Added to that was actually the following. There's actually a whole series of letters where we can actually follow the ship from the instructions given by Sam and William Vernon in Newport in Rhode Island, as they tell Caleb Godfrey, who, by the way, is described as a good Christian, an Anglican, a God-fearing man, that he is to go and get the slaves, preferably young men, to keep a watch over them, give them no opportunity of making an insurrection, let them have a sufficiency of a good diet, be sensible on your voyage. And with that, Caleb Godfrey leaves Newport, New Island. Again, thanks to the database, we can actually trace him. When he begins, they spend 220 days. The journey begins in 1775 in November. They arrive in Africa in March. They leave Africa about a month later, and they arrive in Charleston on the 17th of June, which is when that advertisement actually appeared in the newspaper. You can see here it says they actually begin with 80 enslaved, and then it drops. Somewhere in this percentage is that young boy, is that child. That's where he is. When Godfrey is about to leave Sierra Leone, he actually writes back to Newport and tells them that he has 80 slaves on board, that he's confident in his journey. The journey seems to have been tougher than he had thought it would be, because thanks to the New York Historical Society, we actually have this letter, which he actually writes from Sullivan Island. Now, Sullivan Island is a little island just beside Charleston. And it's through Sullivan Island that approximately 40% of the total enslaved people actually arrived to the North American continent through Sullivan Island. It was a place where they were forced to be, where they quarantined. It's really pretty bad. And as you can see, when he writes, spelling is awful, but when he writes, he actually says, he arrived here with 71 slaves and has lost 3 cents since. He's complaining about people being sick. He's sick himself. And then most of all, what he's saying is he doesn't actually think he's going to make them as much money as he could. It's all about the market. And then here it is. That's just a close-up of that particular bill of sale. And the first person that day, the first person to buy anybody off that boat that day was James Kane, who buys a boy for 130 probably pounds, guineas at that time. James Kane dies 2 years later. And in the inventory of his will, he names 10 enslaved people: Judy, Flora, Fortune, Suzanne, Paris, Prince, Flora, Sharper, London, and Charlotte. Only 2 of these are actually marked as boys, Sharper and London. London, however, is described in the paperwork as being Charlotte's brother. So my gut feeling, and that's all it is that young boy of that sale is probably Sharper. I have no more than a gut feeling, but for those of you who are familiar with the work of Blanche Cook, never mind some of the work of Annette Gordon-Reed, you will know that sometimes if you have a gut feeling, it's probably the way it is. I have a feeling it's Sharper, but we can't be sure. There is, by the way, there are no other records that I've found so far about Sharper, but I will tell you what I hope happened is the following. There's a story. Some of these enslaved were to run away. And there's a story in one of the New England newspapers about a year, maybe 2 after this, whereby they describe a young boy called Sharper who ran away, who had been kidnapped in Africa, and they described him as 16 years old, and that he actually managed to live near Boston for the rest of his life. Somewhere in the back of my head, I actually really, really hope that's Sharper, but I don't know. But another name I'd like to point out to you on this list is Flora. If you remember that first document that I showed you, which was a bill of sale of lumber, on the flip side of that document, when we had flipped the narrative, there's Flora with 2 children. Now, what I don't know is if these 2 children are London and Charlotte. You get the idea here. This is what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to link, I'm trying to find people. I'm trying to give them biography. I'm trying to give them back their story. That's what's vital here. James Cain dies. And the reason James Cain becomes an important part of this story is upon his death, very quickly, his widow marries Samuel Grove. Why Samuel Grove is an important part of the story is that Celia specifically tells us in court that she worked for Samuel and James Grove and Jane Grove. So we now have Samuel Grove in the story, and we know that Celia's story intersects with that of the Groves. How and exactly why, I am not too sure. The other person to be aware of in the story is, of course, John Cain himself, the first John Cain. John Cain is the son of James, who we had just talked about, and Jane. And he's very young when his father dies. And then his mother, as I say, marries Samuel Grove. And they have one surviving child, Jane, and it's her divorce that Celia later testifies in court. Whatever the relationship initially was between Celia and the Grove family, there is no doubt that it was pretty awful for Celia. And the reason is the following. This is a bill of sale. I'm going to try and, I don't know what you guys can see, but I'm trying to move this around a little bit. I'll try and have it a bit closer. And one of the areas that I found, there is a lot of paperwork on this. And what you can see here, I'll kind of get a close up, is there are a lot of bills of sale between the Cains and various other families in the South Carolina, Georgia area. And each time there's a bill of sale, each enslaved person is named on that bill of sale. There's London, we've come across him before. There's Celia, who we're talking about. There's Caesar, who I'll talk about in a few minutes. There's a reference to Celia's mother, Betty, in another document. The chances are this is her. Okay? So each of these names, okay, each of these people, what seems to happen at this time is they're sold, and then sometimes the Cains buy them back. And then sometimes they're sold again, and sometimes they're bought back again, but not always. Here you can see Flora is mentioned as well. We've come across her a few times today. Every time, there's a bill of sale and they're available to us. One of the issues you always have to be aware of when you're dealing with the lives of the enslaved is that there is a cruelty that's obvious. It's a physical cruelty, it's a mental cruelty, it's a cruelty. There's no other word I can use. It's just a matter of how horrific it is. People run away. People run away a lot. People get caught. This, and the University of Bristol, by the way, that database that I was talking about, they're putting together, my understanding is about 12,000 runaway advertisements that appeared in the Carolina and Georgia newspapers from this time period. So that's going to be a huge resource to people studying this. This is a runaway advertisement that was put in the newspaper by Jane Grove. That's John Kane's mother, from Beaufort, January 6, 1781. And in each of these, there's a description, there's a name given of the person, a description, an age, which again, we can put into biographical data. However, there's also a cruelty here that I want you to be aware of. This is the story of Simon. Simon is a tall, stout fellow, formerly the property of George Palmer. Right? George Palmer is deceased. He is rendered remarkable by having the end of his nose cut off. Well, what that actually means is Simon ran away before. Simon stole food, not once, but twice. And there's a physical cruelty that they actually cut off part of his nose. I don't know who did it, just that it happened, and it was not unique. And if you're wondering what happened to this group, we have no other record of Edinburgh, Simon, York, or Johnny from this. I know the Coffee. I don't know about Billy. There's too many. Primus and Isaac were all caught because we have records of them later on being sold. So they did not get away. But this cruelty was constant. This is a letter that John Kane is actually writing to his wife. In it, he writes, Caesar behaves tolerably. I have not been obliged to flog him above half a dozen times. Just because, why? Flog, to beat, to whip above half a dozen times. In the last week, in the last days, we don't know. It's constant cruelty. Two of the other people I would like to talk to you about today, to give you an example, are Violet and Polly. Violet and Polly are mentioned in a number of letters, but one of the ones that I find heartbreaking is the letter that Eliza Goff writes to Susan Kane in 1791. John Kane at this stage had married Susan. Susan was a Livingston. Related, the Livingstons are all related. It's extremely complicated to explain all their relationships. Eliza Goff was Robert Barnwell's sister. Robert Barnwell was a slave trader, plantation owner. His wife was known to be particularly cruel to the enslaved, and his two daughters became abolitionists. Eliza is desperately trying to help Polly and Violet. In this letter that she writes, she actually tells Susan that she has found a place for Polly for 3 years. Polly can live with the school teacher for 3 years. The teacher really wants her for 3 years. And she also tells her that Violet is not capable of going to the fields. Well, in a letter John Kane wrote very soon afterwards, he writes to Susan, you don't say anything about Violet. Violet, don't have her to be an expense for us. If she cannot be sold, give her away. Violet was later sold as part of the divorce settlement to Bartholomew Crevassier, who was also given land both in Paris Island, which was part of John Kane's plantations, and Crevassier also had land in the islands. And I don't know what happened to Violet or to Polly. In terms of Celia's own family, in terms of attitudes towards Celia, we have a pretty horrific realization of what John Kane actually thought of Celia in this letter that he writes in 1788. John Kane and Susan had had a son at this stage. To be honest, Celia had had a child too. She'd had a daughter. And Susan had obviously asked for Celia to go to New York, where she was living, to help out with her and her new son. And John writes, I don't think it'd be worthwhile having Celia. She has a child which cannot be weaned and must, of course, have an attended for it. If she comes, her daughter, the daughter, by the way, I'm pretty sure is Daphne, must come with her. And then he starts to complain about expenses. Then perhaps he says what he really means. Besides, I wish your son's first ideas to be derived from a white person. And if he was here, Celia is not the wench I should trust him to. A white person. That perhaps is the biggest tell of all. It's not a tell, it's blunt. He actually says, a white person. All right? John Kane later gets a job as cashier in the Bank of America. But believe it or not, he brings Celia with him. Celia, he writes, keeps the keys in the markets. And he's actually complaining at this stage that, in all honesty, he has too many enslaved people. He could do away with Sarah and Jacob and Billy and even Miss Daphne's. This, by the way, person here, Daphne, I am pretty sure is Celia's child. All right? A couple of years later, he complains again. Jacob is sick and Celia has to do everything. At this stage, Celia is actually beginning to complain to him. She says she's too old to do too much, and he feels he must let her. John at this stage is sick. He's dying. He's had tuberculosis. He's not going to live an awful lot longer. And he manumits her in his will, providing, if, depends, it seems. When John Kane dies, I want you to see something interesting. These are accounts that I found. And if you notice here, it says paid bills for mourning clothes for Peter, it's the son, and for the wench Celia, her boy Jacob. So we then knew there was 2 children, okay, amounting to that. And then notice Celia's annuity, the first payment of $5 was actually done on July 4th, 1795. The irony. The divorce, again, was to play part of this. It was an expensive divorce. It was a nasty divorce. And like all enslaved people, as soon as something happens to the enslaver, as soon as there's a death, as soon as there's divorce, as soon as there's a money problem, those who suffer the most, the quickest, the most often, and the worst are always the enslaved. In this particular divorce, as I say, it was an expensive divorce. Jane had to give up bonds. John, even in death, and had to give up land to Bartholomew, the ex-husband, and he also had to give up. He also got 44 enslaved persons in groups of 4. Paris Island is part of the land he got. And again, 44 persons were part of this. So where is Celia? What happens? Did she go to Liberty Hall? Did she stay with Susan? At the time of his death, John Kane owned over 8,000 acres of land. He had sold some previously. After his death, Susan sold about 5,000 acres, but still maintained over 3,000 acres of land. The person to whom Celia had worked for most, had been forced to work for most, was actually Jane, John's sister. In the court documents, Celia says that she was her nurse growing up. At this moment, just after the divorce, Jane disappears. We can't find her. I have no idea what happened to her. Interestingly, I can't find Celia after this moment either. I don't know. What I can tell you, however, is that according to records, there is a Caesar cane in Georgia in the mid 1800s. Caesar, remember, Mr. Caesar? It's too old to be him. It's not him because the age is off. But I often wondered, was Celia his mother too? Did she go back with Celia to Georgia? Where did Jane go? Did Susan insist that she went with Jane? Did old age finally catch up with Celia? I'm not sure. Looking specifically at Liberty Hall, it's important for everybody to realize that there's a number of people who have owned Liberty Hall. The Livingston family, the Bolingbrookes, the Eddies, the Salters, and then, yes, the Canes as well. By the time Susan gets to Liberty Hall, at this stage, she claimed ownership over these people, Betty and her child, Eve, Sarah and her son and daughter, Thomas, little Philip as he was called, Philip's mother, who she complains, by the way, has a ferocious temper. I like her a lot. Sirius, Peggy, and their son Elias, Peter, Robert Van Horn, the child of Peter and Susan Van Horn. And in each case, there is a document that explains where Susan acquired these people, as awful as that sounds. What she paid, who she paid for, and please note, in Newark, in Bergen County, in South Brunswick, in Bedminster. Yep, New Jersey, Essex County, Newark, Bergen, South Brunswick, and Bedminster. Peter and Sarah Van Horn were manumitted in 1829. Again, we have their mark. It's vitally important that we have those documents. And the state of New Jersey and Essex County, it's recognized, they're legal. Say their names, Peter and Sarah. It's vitally important that we do that. Under the, according to the 1830 census, there are 11 free people living at Liberty Hall, and they actually give us that breakdown. What they don't do is give us names. Remember, manumission was never equality. Manumission was never abolition. Manumission was never about emancipation. So when we look back at this list, as an academic, part of the job that I'd like to do is to work the same ideas, to look more at William Livingston, to look more at Brockholst, even though he never actually lived at Liberty Hall. It's important to notice. Bolingbroke, Eddy, and Salter. We need to look at those documents. There are documents that we're just finding regarding to William Livingston, which certainly leave us in no doubt that there were enslaved people who helped build Liberty Hall. Again, this should not be a surprise. There were enslaved people who were forced to build the White House. Right? William Livingston did manumit, as Dr. Hyde said. He's very clear in this. He says, a woman called Bell and her male child called Lambert, both born in my family in a state of slavery. Right? So he has more enslaved people. He claims ownership over more, but these two he has manumitted at this moment. However, when his daughter comes to visit and she asks if she can bring her enslaved, he says yes. Manumission is never abolition. It's important to remember that. So where were the enslaved people at Liberty Hall? The short answer is we're not sure. The Liberty Hall that we see today is not the original Liberty Hall. We have some older documents that Dr. Hyde has found, but we don't know. But there is a reference to a small room on the stairs. And then that small room on the stairs, according to the inventory of the will of William Livingston, it's furnished worse than anywhere else. But in it, there is a bed and a small cot, enough for a mother and a child, Bell and Lambert. Okay? It's more than possible. So what do I have in my database? In my database right now, I have the names of over 130 enslaved people over whom the Kane family have claimed ownership. I have hundreds of other references. I also have hundreds of, in all honesty, primary sources and documents that can back up this, that have attitudes to them. So looking at Liberty Hall, it's a complicated history, but the most vital part of this history is that we don't erase. What I would like to do is the following. First of all, I would like to say that I'd like to write a history blog telling you, telling more people about Celia's story. I'm hoping that, in all honesty, I will have my first academic article out by the end of the summer. There's a lot more research to be done. I only recently found land documents which actually give me exact geographical location for each part of the John Kane plantation in South Carolina and Georgia. There's also land in the islands, which also needs to be looked at. In some of the areas in South Carolina and Georgia, there are already archaeological digs happening on those places, and they give us a much closer idea of where the enslaved live, what they look like. Some of them survived till just the cusp. Some of the enslaved areas survived till just around the time of the Civil War, which means there are photographs, which is vital. In terms of teaching units, as Dr. Hyde said, every student in 1062 gets to know these enslaved people, gets to know about it, and we use it. I use it in my US History 1 class and also my New Jersey history class. But perhaps two of the most important things I would like to come out of this is, one, I would like to propose that we would build at Kane, certainly as part of the history department, certainly as part of my work, a model that is based on, but not exactly the same as, the models of a database in the University of Bristol and the University College London. That what would be different with ours is the narrative would be flipped. We would have this database, but it would be biographical based. It would be based on the enslaved. It would be based on the people. It would be based on their lives. It could have all these documents there. It's absolutely vital that we don't erase, that we remember, that we say their names. But perhaps most important of all, what I would really like to see is a memorial to Celia. This amazing African-American strong woman who survived, who helped others to survive, who helped her children to survive. That in the end, she felt freedom. She got to write her mark. Legally, she got to say her name is Celia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nicholson, for that really extraordinarily powerful presentation. I know how long you've been working on this, and the detective work is extraordinary. The careful collection of documents is amazing. Scholars who work in this field, I know, struggle so much to be able to trace the enslaved through the names and to even to find them in two documents, and you have some in multiple documents between the manumission, the records of the ship Hare, the records that we have from the Bill of Lumber, and into the divorce records, and then even later is really extraordinary. I think it's a real reminder of the resources that we have here, and then how that work goes outward. You've acknowledged how many other people have contributed to this project as well, and so to me it was really masterful, and I can't thank you enough. We're getting a lot of comments as well into our chat acknowledging that, how revealing it was, how vital and vitally important this work really is. I know that one of the pieces that has proven to be most challenging and continues to be most challenging is trying to trace more specifically about the enslaved men, women, and children that lived at Liberty Hall. We have Bell and Lambert. We have Sarah and Peter Van Horn. That document has always moved me with them making their mark on that manumission, and their manumission is similar to Celia's in that, yes, they're manumitted on and will earn a salary as long as they continue essentially to provide the same service and do the same tasks that they did enslaved. It's not freedom. Manumission is not freedom. It's not emancipation. And I thought you said that so powerfully. What else do you think we can know, and what do you think we should hope to know about the enslaved specifically at Liberty Hall? And to piggyback on that, we also got a question in the chat asking if there are any enslaved that are buried at Liberty Hall.
I don't think there are any that are buried at Liberty Hall. But what I would like to suggest is that there are a number of graveyards yet around Elizabeth that I think are certainly worth our time and effort as historians to go and to look there. One of the things I think that has to be done next in terms of Liberty Hall is taking those names and then working our way through the various census returns. And then going through various church records around the area. That I think will give us more into Liberty Hall. I think we have to apply the same ideas that I have applied to South Carolina and Georgia, and apply those to Liberty Hall and to the various, let's say there's not just the Canes and the Livingston, there's other families who were there as well. I think it's absolutely vitally important that we get as much information about them as possible. I think what I would love to do is I would love for us, and I'm just hoping that, I know that Liberty Hall want to do this, that we work with Liberty Hall to get some biographies together, that we give the respect to the enslaved. And I think part of doing that, what would be different about any database I think that we could think of doing is literally to provide more of a biography. Dr. Hyde and I were actually ended up at because one does at a kind of a conference on Saturday, and they were using databases. But one of the points I think they were trying to make is that, you know, you can't just deal with data. These are people, and the danger of just looking at data is silence. So therefore, what's vitally important is that we undo the silence and we put names. And I think that is what Liberty Hall is about. I think what the College of Liberal Arts is all about. And I think what the Department of History is all about with this project.
That's really fantastic. Naming is such a central feature of your presentation, and doing biographies for the enslaved as we're able to trace them fits into that. We are all, of course, aware that there's been a number of spirited debates about places, buildings, institutions that are named for people and for families that claim the ownership of Black bodies. I wonder if you could share maybe some of your thoughts about how what we're learning about the Cane and the Livingston families contributes to those questions.
You know, what we have to do is, I think we have to flip the narrative more. By flipping a narrative, we change our focus. By changing our focus, we recognize. And I think by recognizing people, by giving names, I think that's vital. I think in terms of Liberty Hall, we have to look at, you know, the harsh reality of slavery. We have to look at the irony of the people who say liberty, but it's the same irony of all men were created equal. And whatever he meant, he did not mean all men. He meant some of them, some of the time, depending. So with liberty, it's awkward as well. But I think what we have here is, you know, an opportunity for us as historians, as a department, and maybe as a college, not that I want to put you in too awkward a position here, but actually to take this project and to move forward. And I think we can definitely do that with the various parties. I'm seeing that people here are offering here, and I'm really excited about some of the stuff I'm seeing in the chat here in terms of looking at various graveyards and things like that. And next time, if anybody, I know we have a couple of people from Philly here, but it's the house was in Market Street in Philly, is where the Canes were. And maybe next time you're walking in Philadelphia, just take a look around and see if Celia's there. Tell her I said hello.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm closer to Philly than to Kane, so I'll have to check that out the next time. You talked about this being a history department project, a College of Liberal Arts project. The college and the university are certainly engaged in a really dramatic series of efforts that are university wide in order to improve the diversity and inclusion, anti-racism, and social justice across the campus in our curriculum and in every aspect of the university. And President Repollet has really been leading by example with that. And so I do think that that's an important aspect. And so what do you see as next steps for the larger community so that we can continue to do that, the advancement of that project? I know that history honors students and students in your classes and in other classes have been working on this. We got comments earlier in the chat about Africana studies and how they might be able to be a part of this project. So what other opportunities are there for students to get involved, for other members of the campus community to be able to get involved in this really vital work?
First of all, let me say what I have just outlined here is just a snippet, really. I would like to, be very clear that, this part is my project, but that there is a huge conversation for us all to have here. And there is a ton of work for us all to do here. There are so many documents that we still have to go through. There is so much we could do. We could certainly use the help always of the computer people, the science people, photography people. I would like to also have a shout out to two of my classes in particular, my History 4000 class, which really is going to do, I know, a magnificent job, absolutely and utterly magnificent job, helping out Liberty Hall. Also an earlier shout out to an earlier honors history class that I taught a little while ago. I think I see some of them still around the place. And they were kind of instrumental in beginning a lot of this conversation. But I think what we have to do right now is, I think we have to have a conversation about where we want this project to go. There's a lot of work still to be done. Quite literally, only a couple of weeks ago, I got my hands, I know nobody will be able to see it, I got my hands on a whole series of documents that quite literally show me the exact geographical location of each of the pieces of property that John Kane had at the end of his life. And what I would love to do, for example, is be able to trace each of the enslaved people to each of these. It's a complicated computer project, but I think it can be done. And then for us as a community, I think it's vital for us to come together to recognize the people, to say their names, maybe for us to have that conversation. I don't want to put anybody in an awkward position, but if there's anybody from DEI on here, I would urge them to help us to create this on campus. I think it would be vital.
We got other questions, I think specifically regarding the slave voyage of the ship Hare,
Yeah.
which is fascinating, and that slave trade database, is just an extraordinary resource. So, do we know any more about how the enslaved that were then transported in the Middle Passage on that horrendous journey that you documented? Do we know how were the enslaved kidnapped there in Sierra Leone? Would they have been kidnapped in the interior and then brought to the coast and essentially resold? And then there's a second question, and this fits in with that, but also with what you were talking about in terms of tracing the lives of those enslaved. Were the enslaved that you, Billy and Primus in particular, do we believe that those were born on plantations in South Carolina and Georgia, or are they being imported directly from Africa?
I'll do the first one first. There's an interesting thing with the Hare. There's two journeys done with the Hare. The first one has actually also been extremely well documented. Actually, micro-history is the only way I could describe. Work has been done by Sean Kelly out of the University of Exeter in England. And he has a document for that first journey that I haven't found as yet for the second journey. his document for that first journey actually has the list of the enslaved that Caleb Godfrey bought in Africa from other traders in Africa. He actually has that document. I can only presume then that Godfrey did the very same thing the next year round, that he went to the slave traders in Africa. These are white English, Scottish slave traders who were working in Africa. And he went to them and he actually traded with them. In his first ship, he actually brings, believe it or not, huge amounts of alcohol. He brings tobacco and he brings other foodstuffs that he trades for the enslaved. And we can only presume that he did it again. There's problems. I have been in contact with an archivist in Sierra Leone. There's an island there that gives us a little bit of information, and there are literally documents there that can do that. So I suspect they were traded. We're not sure. It's really interesting. When the divorce happened, and this was a nasty divorce. And it was in our money, like it's $1 million plus divorce, in all honesty, that's happening. But one of the reasons it's awkward is that Courvoisier, who's about to become Jane's ex-husband, is refusing to take ownership of many of the enslaved because of the fact that they're children. That he's actually complaining about that. So there are a huge number of children that are born at various parts of the John Kane land. Whether specifically Billy or Primus were, I'm not sure. It's kind of the next part of the project is I need to look more at children. Often they don't name the children. Like they're given names, but they're sold so fast. It's very hard for me to tell, but it is an area certainly I'm going to work on. And because Jonathan, Dr. Mercantini, Dean Mercantini, you're on the call, you know I would not be doing my due diligence as an academic unless I made a plea for time off and a budget. Otherwise, academics everywhere will absolutely throw me out of my academic stronghold. But I do think that this is the type of project that I would love to see Kane get together and behind and put a little bit of time and a little bit of budget behind it. And I think we could do some great work here. We really could do some great work.
Well, certainly I'm strongly supportive of the new R2 initiative and Kane questing to become the next great urban research university in New Jersey. I know that Dr. Hyde has advanced a number of proposals and that the collective deans university-wide recognize the need for our faculty to have the time and the resources, the travel resources, and publishing opportunities and all of that in order to get this important work out. And the painstakingness in which you went through it, I think highlights that. So I'm hoping that we can do that. I don't know if you're able to read the comments, but Katricia Shaw from the DEI office is here and she is excited, it sounds like, to be able to be a part of this project and to look for ways that we can partner with the DEI office, which has done such amazing work in as it's grown and kind of been reconfigured in such a short time here already. So that is a piece of it. We also had a question from Eric asking about ways to work between Africana Studies and the History Department to specifically to look at the American history curriculum and to create a more multicultural story of American history. I know that the project that Dr. Hyde outlined in the History 1062 class, in which we're using in some cases the same documents that you shared as part of your presentation for all the students in the History 1062 to do that. The college DEI committee, which has been meeting all year, and there's a university curriculum initiative as well to ensure that we are presenting a more broadly inclusive and diverse, that's what DEI stands for after all, history, and it wouldn't just be in American history, but that would really be an important place to start. I mean, I think as you've shown, this is an Atlantic history, this is an international history, both when it occurred in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, and also having to do it where you're using British resources, you're using African sources, and in some cases Caribbean sources following the Lucenas and Courvoisier. among others. So I don't know if you had additional thoughts or comments on that.
That's exactly, I think, what we need to do. I just totally support the DEI office. I've had some great conversations with them on other topics. And I'm thinking, yes, let's partner on this. Let's partner on more. They're a fabulous office, fabulous people. And I think this is a great opportunity for everybody.
We also have Mateo asking about the documents and the preservation of the documents. And I know you and I as scholars get frustrated how so little is left behind, but it's a good reminder of how much there actually is, and it's extraordinary to think. Susan, John Kane never lived in Liberty Hall,
Yeah, exactly.
right? And yet we have so many of the letters that he sent to Susan, which are an important part of this story, and other kinds of documents. So I don't know if you had other thoughts just in all of your archival globetrotting.
Yeah, it's always amazing to me what's still there. There are huge amounts of documents. Some of these, as say, date back right 1756. And beforehand, James Kane probably came to this country about 1743 from the best we can kind of put together. We don't have documents going back that far, but we do have legal documents of him in this country in the early 1750s. So it is amazing. They are there. Some of them are not in great condition, but as I've been very lucky. We have some fabulous archivists. We have some fabulous people who can preserve documents. And thankfully, they're very strict with us about rules and touching them and making sure we have gloves and everything else. And I would also mention that a lot of these are being digitized and put up on a website so that everybody can see them. They do have awful 18th century writing, but thanks to iPads, that's a little bit easier because we can just make everything bigger, and we actually can get a chance of reading them through, which is really phenomenal. So yeah, Mateo, it's a great point. It really is.
And then we have one last question, which is talking about just the geography of Liberty Hall, and then is also what's known as the main campus. The questioner refers to it as a plantation. I know that in some of my work, because Liberty Hall under the Livingstons is not engaged in the production of staple crops, they're providing farming for the house. They have the Canes have plantations in South Carolina, and not trying to minimize that, but the characterization of Liberty Hall as a plantation is one that I think is a little less clear, but nevertheless the geography and the land on the main side of campus, and then going to East Campus and also around Liberty Hall. Yeah,
that's the land. It's a play with words, really, is what it is, because there isn't cotton, basically, because there isn't rice, there isn't indigo. The word plantation isn't used, but are there enslaved people there? Yes. Were they forced to live there? Yes. Were their lives miserable? Yes. John Kane himself uses the word plantation on a number of occasions in letters to Susan, but since he never lived at Liberty Hall, they obviously refer to his land in Georgia and South Carolina, of which there was a substantial amount. The rest of it, in all honesty, is kind of a major farmland. Don't forget, there was a tavern the other side, which Dr. Regal and Dr. Frank Esposito at various times have to look at there. So that will be in all honesty. Susan did live in Elizabethtown. Whether or not Celia stayed with her, as they say, or whether she stayed with Jane, that's kind of the big question that's in my head about Celia. Did she stay with Jane? Susan certainly didn't seem to like her that much, let me put it like that. But nevertheless, she does buy her mourning clothes, which is kind of interesting in itself. So,
Dr. Nicholson, again, I can't thank you enough. We had over 70 attendees for this event, which is really fantastic. So thanks to our audience. We got really great questions. I think we got a lot of excitement and positive energy to continue to advance this work. This project is going to take everyone involved in the Kane community, students, faculty, staff, everyone along the way to be a part of it. And it's a fantastic project, and one that really the big picture that merits our attention and our energy, and to identify more of these enslaved men, women, and children who lived and labored at Liberty Hall, who lived and labored as part of those families, and to be able to identify them. This is only the beginning of this work. This is the first of many conversations that we hope to have on this, and based on the turnout that we had and the interest that we have in this and the importance that we all associate with it, I'm confident that we will continue to have these conversations and be able to have more and more different communities from our campus and other stakeholders involved in it. But this is such a fantastic opening and way to share this really important work. So thank you. Thanks to everyone. Dr. Hyde, I don't know if you had additional thoughts to close us out.
Just, I can't thank Breed enough for this thoughtful, serious, moving recovery of Celia's history. And thank you to Dr. Nicholson and Dr. Mercantini for the conversation that followed. And to reiterate what both of them said, this is a first step. This is the first step in what we hope is going to be a much longer, larger, deeper investigation into this important part of our history. So we thank everybody for joining us tonight and taking this first step with us, and watch for future opportunities to collaborate with us.
Thank you all. Good night.
Well, stay safe, stay healthy.
Please.
Good night.